Hello and welcome to Colaba Conversation 2021, where we are looking at the long term implications of the pandemic and the policy measures that are needed to address the crisis. As we know, women have faced the brunt of the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, from unemployment to loss of income and livelihood opportunities, rise in food and nutrition insecurity, rise in unpaid care work, and in domestic violence. As we discuss economic recovery in India in a post COVID context, it is imperative that we put women and girls at the center of this economic recovery. Data from December 2020 in India showed that almost 47% of working women suffered a permanent job loss in comparison to only 7% among men. 1 year later, as we have this discussion today, how can we learn from this crisis to ensure a gender responsive recovery? What policies should be taken to address the destructive impact of the pandemic on women? What investments and budgetary allocations should be made to turn policy into action? With these questions in mind, we have assembled an excellent panel of speakers. Please allow me to introduce them. Priyanka Chaturvedi is Member of Parliament from Rajya Sabha in India. Yamini Iyer is President and Chief Executive, Center for Policy Research in India. Victoria Panova is Vice President for International Relations at the Far Eastern Federal University in Russia. And Chetna Gala Sinha is founder and chair at Mandeshi Bank. Thank you very much for taking our time for this discussion. We have about 45 minutes, and I'd like to start by inviting each of you to offer your thoughts on this topic very briefly. If we can start with Ms. Chaturvedi and Yamini, move to Dr. Panova, and then Ms. Sinha.
As far as women and conversations post pandemic are concerned, while we still continue to be living in the pandemic right now, we have observed and statistics show, when you began your introductory statement, statistics show that women have been at the receiving end far more, much more than any other gender. When I say any other gender, I meant the men. As far as women are also concerned, when we talk about the post pandemic recovery, we need to understand that whether it is the mental health issues, whether it was the digital gap, whether it was vaccination gap, whether it was job losses, whether it was domestic violence, whether it was being pushed out of jobs, women have faced the brunt of it. And moving forward, we have taken several steps backwards as compared to our SDG goals, and we need to ensure that our focus continues to remain on ensuring more empowerment to women, economic growth model for women, as well as making them the central focus of the entire post-pandemic recovery. And that is what I would want to see. And as far as Maharashtra government is concerned, we did realize these gaps that exist and prevail. So we did organize gender-based camps, vaccination camps. We made it easier for women who are pregnant, who are lactating mothers. In fact, I led that entire conversation even at the center, and the center did realize that these were the gaps that prevailed for women, and which, as far as vaccine hesitancy was concerned, women were not facing a vaccine hesitancy, but there was almost a vaccination denial for them. So those were gaps that we worked on, and we're working towards a post-pandemic recovery. When we talk about economic empowerment, we also, I would want to see more women coming forward as stakeholders in the conversation. We want to see when we talk about the union budget, where women get soft loans to recover from their losses, where business women are concerned, and perhaps corporate companies looking at women-centric model of hiring. So those are a few inputs that I have, and I'm hoping that we would look at that as a whole when we talk about recovery and keep women as the center of the entire conversation.
Thank you so much. More women as stakeholders, as you said, that's something that we would like to return to. Yamini, would you like to step in now?
Thank you. I think a lot of what I have to say will echo what Priyanka Chaturvedi said just before me. As you pointed out in your opening remarks too, women have been at the receiving end of the pandemic-induced chaos in the economy, ravages in the health system, and any serious attempt at rebuilding will require a much more focused effort at addressing the challenges that women confront. And I want to highlight three. You spoke at the start of in your opening remarks, and Priyanka mentioned this as well. Women's employment faced a significant hurdle as a consequence of the job losses overall due to the pandemic. Let's not forget that in any disruption to the economy, female labor force is the first to get hit, and it finds it very difficult to re-enter the economy. We saw this in India in the context of demonetization, where women, if member participants in the economy, were the first ones to lose their jobs and the last ones to rebuild. In fact, Mahesh Vyas of CMI points out that the cohort of women that lost jobs in the demonetization phase never actually re-entered the labor force. It was a new cohort of workers that entered the labor force 2 years after the demonetization, when we saw a slight uptick in female labor force participation. Also, don't forget that we are talking about female labor force participation in the context of an economy which, at its pre-pandemic rates of GDP growth, had the lowest participation of women in its workforce compared to any other comparable country. So there are very structural reasons why female employment has been difficult in India that predate the pandemic. There are well-known realities of economic disruptions that make it hard for women to re-enter the workforce, and therefore any policy solution has to recognize the consequences of structural issues as well as short-term ruptures to be able to build back. One way in which we have tended to build back is through social safety net programs. Narega is an important example of that. And if you look at Narega employment history before the pandemic, it was an important source of female unskilled employment for India. One of the elements of what has happened through the pandemic, rather, since we're not quite post the pandemic, and we need to study this and understand this a lot more, is that when both men and women have been pushed out of the labor force, it is men that are taking over the space that used to exist for female labor force. So even our social protection network is no longer large enough or elastic enough to respond to the economic needs of women. This means greater investment in social safety nets and also a rethinking of the structure of our social safety net architecture to respond to the peculiar challenge that we confront today. The third point I want to make: India has been at the helm of, across the globe, the longest closure of schools. We have the dubious distinction of closing both public and private schools for longer than most other countries across the globe, and we still haven't fully opened, particularly primary schools. What we do know from some early data that is coming out on the shifts that have taken place in the school ecosystem is that you see a huge increase of enrollment from private schools into public schools. We need to look at the gender differentiation of this data, because it is entirely possible that in this pushback into the system, girls' education is going to suffer. Also, it is entirely likely that as incomes recover, parental choice will mean that possibly parents will invest more in boys' education than girls. These are old patterns that are going to get exacerbated. And girls are going to be required to support their families in times of crisis a lot more. Therefore, their attendance in school as they start opening up is also likely to going to be a lot more fractured than it used to be. Again, these are all old structural problems that are getting exacerbated in the context of COVID and the impact of the pandemic. The recently released NFHS 5 data gives us a very interesting factoid, which is that female girls' education has actually, in 10 years of schooling of girls' education, has actually improved since the last NFHS. We risk losing the gains we have made in these as a consequence of the pandemic. So again, a very structured, focused, and agile policy response that recognizes the realities in which girls and boys are living, the reality of their families' reduced incomes, the reality of the kind of enhanced input into education that is going to be needed for girls. It may mean thinking of more input outside of the formal school system to girls that comes from policy, are all going to be necessary if you have to bridge the gap. So to close, essentially, the pandemic has exaggerated structural challenges that the Indian economy confronts with creating inclusive labor markets that encourage female participation in the economy. It is urgent and imperative that we have agile policy response to this very specific problem, and we do not assume that eventually growth will trickle down and the dynamics of growth will bridge these gaps. They will have to be carefully addressed and bridged. Civil society will play a very, very important role. So, encouraging civil society into building new kinds of policy frameworks is going to be essential, and investing in women has to be a national priority.
Thanks for raising those very thoughtful points. And what could the agile policy response be? Perhaps we can discuss in the course of this conversation. It's over to you, Dr. Panova.
Thank you so much. I think I can only just add to what's been already said, although the situation in Russia could be different in terms of how women, what type of problems women had as opposed to India. But nevertheless, we could say that the situation is the same all over the world with regards to the pandemic exacerbating pre-existing barriers and knocking back progress across several areas for women, especially from health to the economy, from education to political participation. While women do remain on the forefront of the pandemic and are among the hardest hit by COVID-19, a lot has been said already about job losses, and there are different data that is given, different international organizations are counting it. Another data there was all around the world that women are likely to have 13 million less jobs as a result of the pandemic than men. And situation is different across the countries, obviously. And numerous polls and research conducted over the past 2 years also suggest that at least 1 out of 4 women are considering downshifting or leaving the workforce altogether due to the high pressure experienced during the pandemic with the intensified work with child care and household duties. So it's both the factors when jobs are lost and cut, places are cut for women, especially as opposed to men, and women experiencing higher pressures are likely to be leaving those jobs. At the same time, we see that evidence offers examples of relatively more successful fight against the pandemic with women in leadership positions. And it's not neither in Russia nor in India, but we have, for example, in Finland, Prime Minister Sanna Marin, who concentrated her policies on issues of equality, environmental sustainability, fair social security, and thus it brought about anti-record incidence of COVID-19 rates in the country. There are other cases with women in leadership. At the same time, that's good, we have here the panel parliamentarian, but we still all around the world have only about a quarter of women who are parliamentarians. And I can tell you that the latest Duma composition, we have in fact less women as opposed to the previous Duma. So it went down while women are likely to be taking decisions which will take into account more effects that would influence their well-being of the whole of the population. So this is important for women to remain in such areas, not just in rank and file, which we are seeing in health, in social care, in education. So there are 2 issues that I want to bring from there. One is we need more comprehensive gender disaggregated data during the pandemic. It's really scattered now. even more than before, not only by international organizations, by on national levels, and those could be standard and put together, and then policy measures should be taken. Another one, we need more women in policy taking places. We need more women and more opportunities for them. And now even more than before with regards to digital technologies, with regards to their access to finance, access to infrastructure. We've had, for example, if we take BRICS, where India and Russia are both participants, we have the Women Business Alliance, but it looks like it is not enough by now. It's not enough to do what is done there. We need to take an overall approach for women policy measures in BRICS. One of the things we do within Women 20 is dealing with issues and offering recommendations for overcoming pandemics in health, in economy, in digital finance, in entrepreneurship, etc. Another very important point is that it is estimated that at least every third woman had experienced violence during her lifetime, but the problem has further exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during the lockdowns. And while official statistic doesn't always support this evidence, but there are a number of NGOs in all of our countries that which open hotlines for such and for such statements, for such women calls, and they help. And I think we need to address this on a more an official level, take this problem and adopt policy measures in order to overcome it. So there are a number of other issues I'd like to talk about, but I think I'll leave them for the discussion later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Panova. You've shown us how, while there may be differences between countries, there are just so many commonalities to the challenges that we face that solutions can be found together. And I'd like to return to that later. For now, if we can hear from Chetna ji.
Hi, thanks for getting me in this, giving me an opportunity for this conversations. I would like to focus on about this financial inclusion, and also not just financial inclusion, but from how can we get women from financial inclusion to financial integration. Why I'm using this terminology is that, we have heard all the stories about the pandemic from the panelists, but also we have seen, right, that pandemic also, how did women react to it? I do think there's a lot to learn from that how did they react to pandemics? And I would like to suggest some, like, in 2018, when I was at World Economic Forum Davos, co-chairing Davos, we did a study on World Economic Forum did the study on women entrepreneurship and jobs or gender gap. You know what study mentioned, and it was very important. Yamini, you would agree with me that it will take 135 years to bridge the gap. Now, my obvious response, and it is not mine, when I shared this with women entrepreneurs in the villages, they said, we are not ready to wait for 135 years to bridge the gap. And I think all of us will agree, right? We are not going to wait for the two generations that it will take so many years to bridge the gap. So then when we say that we deny to wait for so long, what are we suggesting? So number one, I would say that a lot of studies also says that in the entrepreneurship sector, when we see women-owned businesses or when we see gender and entrepreneurship, it's so clear that only 14% of women own business. And out of that 14%, 90% are solo entrepreneurs. Now, if 90% are solo entrepreneurs, which means they themselves do their business, how are we going to create the jobs? The jobs are going to be created in big manufacturing units. I doubt, because that's what we have been doing it. So I do think that we have to have a very separate lens with that how do we focus on women-owned enterprise and how do we focus on creating jobs for women in women-owned enterprise. And in that, I would just like to give an example, very small example, which will also lead to policy suggestion. And that is that during pandemic, one of our women lead, Lakshmi Bai, in one of the drought area of Man Taluka, she started a dal mill, and then which means she was selling the pulses and dal, and she was doing her business quite well. She went to the bank for the loan to buy the machinery. Bank denied her the loan. Why? Because she did not have any digital history of having the loan. So the question comes that how are you going to address the first time borrower? There is no credit rating. There is no, you do not have your rating on the high mark CIBIL rating, which clearly indicates that as the MP mentioned about the small soft loans, that are we ready? Banks are ready to give loans to women-owned enterprise. So number one, they will be ready when the ecosystem is there. If we get a data of women-owned businesses, and that can be data, open data for the banks, then banks will come forward. Now, this lady saved her money, bought the machinery. The machinery vendor said that I will not install the machinery, call your husband, because you are not able to operate the machinery. The second challenge, how society is looking at this, right? Because society feels that women cannot run the machine. And so for all that reason, we need such role models. So this lady said that I will operate the machine, and why don't you come? I will pay for you. And she started the dal mill. I'm so proud that every day she produces 2 tons of dal, and she has employed 5 more women. And this lady, Lakshmi Bai, she comes from the Dalit community. She is breaking century old caste barriers. While giving this example, what I'm trying to say is that at the last mile, women are ready to integrate themselves in micro entrepreneurship. At the last mile, women are ready to do the digital transaction. They want they are using smartphones and they want to do digital financial transaction. What we are doing is providing digital financial literacy. As Dr. Panova mentioned, right, that digitalization is so important. So how much data do we have? So can we bring that data on public good? I mean, what I would say while giving this example and actually closing my first brief remarks is that the policymakers will have to give a red carpet for women-owned enterprise, because they are going to create the jobs for other women. And why not let us bring those all role models? Policymakers should celebrate these women-owned enterprise who are running the business, who are taking so much of risk, who are ready to take the loan, who have repaid the loan and led these businesses and given a jobs to others. Why don't we celebrate them as a role model, give them award? Then the other women will see that as an opportunity and they will set up the business. Then and then only we will be able to bring the disruption on the indexes, on the data which we are getting so negative data about the women entrepreneurs, about the gender gap. If we really want to disrupt it, I think the last mile women are ready to crack. They have never been to the schools, but they are using digital phones. They are doing digital financial literacy. Why don't we? And they are doing digital financial transaction. So all policymakers and civil society, we should learn from these women at grassroots and provide them a red carpet so that we can close this gender gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've given us a rallying call for this discussion. Women will not be waiting for 2 generations to bridge this gap. To take off from what you said, Ms. Chaturvedi, Chetna ji just made a very strong case for how women at the last mile are ready. And the one question that I want to ask you is about gender budgeting. India spends a tiny part of its budget, about 10%, for women, which is half of the population. The gender budget this year, as you would be aware, was in fact slightly lower than it was last year. The allocations for women and child ministry were decreased, and allocations for really important programs, which should have increased, especially with the pandemic, nutrition, creches, women's safety, remain the same. But this is not a topic that makes its way into any sort of popular appeal. How can this be turned into something that politicians and policymakers care for?
So I'd like to begin by saying something extremely controversial, which but needs to be said. Unfortunately, over the years, positions that can bring a transformation to women empowerment, to women inclusion, financial inclusion, etc., have been very political in nature, right from the ministers to all the various state boards, women commission, etc., are very highly political in nature. If we want to address this particular policy gap, we would have to go beyond our politics to be able to address it as a gender issue. And that is why I think we have been lagging in terms of budgeting for women, financial inclusion for women, talking about women beyond our politics. And that is something I have been advocating for ever since I have been a part of politics, that some issues rise above your politics. Let's not reduce gender issues on our politics and on the basis of how we happen to be in power and we cannot speak on certain issues. When we are out of power, we are most vocal about these issues. So we need to rise above that. So that is perhaps one reason why women in political spaces haven't been able to come together to be a collective voice, to be able to address gender related narratives. And that is something we really need to look at afresh, appointments afresh. Those who will be taking on these responsibilities should be those who are not reduced by their politics, but they enhance policies with regards to this. So that is point one. With regards to point two, which Chetna ji was talking about, she made some really valid points. And there is something that I also have been pursuing, and I'm hoping that it will happen in Maharashtra, where we will start an all women bank where we support women entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs coming from rural areas at lower rate of interest, make loans accessible, make finance accessible for women, because we have also seen that women at the grassroots level, like she mentioned, one very, very positive case, but women at grassroots level hesitate to scale up their businesses because they, while they can pay off their loans, etc. For example, I'd like to give you one example of Mavim. Mavim is the Maharashtra Arthik Vikas Mandal for Women, Mahila Arthik Vikas Mandal for Women. They provide soft loans to women at lower interest rates. And they have not found any loan turn into a bad loan, or women haven't returned those loans that they have taken, but yet they hesitate to approach public banks. They hesitate to approach larger banks or mid-level banks. So we are looking at creating a more accessible environment for financial inclusion. However, it cannot be a success till it is not pushed from the central level. When the center comes forward and it says that women are going to be the focus area for us, and women are going to be the job creators of tomorrow, women are going to be economic participants of tomorrow, rather it should have been today, but it is for tomorrow that we plan, considering we are looking at every policy afresh post COVID and the problems that showed us, the loopholes that showed us. We would need to focus our energies on that. And she's absolutely right when she says women who create businesses also create jobs, and we need to facilitate that. And policies can only happen when politics rises above its own, I would say, silos that we are working in, and some issues that go beyond politics need to be looked at from that point of view, and not through from the narrow prism of politics and politicking.
That's a very important point you made about how women sometimes hesitate to scale up their businesses. And that's something that we can take to Chetna ji, and also look at women in self-help groups, perhaps, and how far can we take those through policy support. But before that, Yamini, you'd made a case for improving the safety and social security net for women in your opening remarks. Survey after survey, of course, keeps showing us, especially after the pandemic, that is what is needed. And yet, there seems to be a policy gap when it comes to that, also in terms of fiscal policy being oriented towards gender equity. As a policy researcher, what is it that you think can be done?
Thanks, Sarina. So before I respond to your specific question, I just wanted to sort of add to what Priyanka said, particularly about the urgency to rise up above politics and have a broader vision. When I look at how the gender narrative has been shaped in our politics and specifically in the nature of our welfare politics, I see a very interesting contradiction. Over the last decade or so, the woman voter has become a fairly critical part of the electoral calculation in a way that wasn't so, I think, a decade plus ago. And you can see this also in voting data as more women are coming out to vote. And interestingly, more women are voting independently of choices that are being made internally for them and their homes. An important sign of empowerment, by the way. Our political party response has been to view women as a really important political constituency. You see scheme after scheme, Beti Bachao Andolan, Ujwala, and it's across parties. I was studying Bihar very closely for its education work in the first two terms of Nitish Kumar. And what was particularly interesting about what Bihar government was doing at the time was that, in fact, it was actively nurturing women as a constituency for education. The Cycle Yojana for girls' education became a national best practice. Many other states replicated it. Jivika, mobilizing women's self-help groups. All of this sort of built around the idea of the woman voter and of building and pursuing policy and politics centered on women. Yet, I think that there's a significant gap because even as this policy is directed at women for electoral gain, it isn't necessarily policy that responds to women's needs. So let's just take Ujwala, which is been presented to the country as a very important national success, a program designed specifically for women. No doubt, on first principles, indoor pollution is a significant issue. Clean cooking fuel is an important, empowering thing for women. Yet only about 58% of women actually have access to clean cooking fuel. So we actually need to think about policy, not in terms of new schemes that you can launch in the name of women and have nice rhetoric that you can take to the polls. We have to think of policy that understands women's needs and builds policy that, in fact, responds to their everyday needs and priorities, not an imagination of what it means to be a woman sitting here for even you and I. Our levels of empowerment and, in fact, our fight as women is somewhat different to the fight that many women in rural India, poorer contexts, etc., have to face. We also need to learn to respect the challenges that women face and their own quiet revolutions that they have internally in their homes. We don't make policy. In fact, we actually don't record lives of women in their everyday struggles. We record lives of the heroines, the women like Priyanka who break boundaries, come into politics, who lead the way as leaders. We record the stories of women who suffer. We record the stories of women in Hathras, women in Unnao who have suffered due to patriarchy, due to violence against women. We don't record the struggles, the challenges, the successes of everyday lives of women, how they are renegotiating their family dynamics, how they are renegotiating their relationship in the economy, in the marketplace, with their husbands, with their parents, with their in-laws. Till we don't understand that, we will not be able to develop a policy environment that genuinely supports needs and priorities of women. We will talk of women as heroes and we will talk of women as victims. We will not talk of women as real people who need an enabling policy. This means that policymakers, policy researchers like myself, civil society, people who record society, journalists, writers, need to start telling these stories, stories of everyday women, and celebrating those. Exactly as Chetna ji was describing, the woman going to the bank is a serious form of a significant empowerment. Women are not waiting, they are moving on their own. We need to understand that. That also means that when we talk about social protection, social policy, I worry when we talk about them specifically from the point of view of what this does for women. If you look at Jandhan Yojana, direct benefit transfers, maternity benefits, everything, all of this these are all programs directed at women. You look at the male rhetoric of female empowerment in election rallies, they will tell you we are opening bank accounts to give income transfers in women's names because women are responsible for household decisions. You're objectifying and typifying a certain role that women play. You're not asking women what they really want. So I would argue for a robust, broad-based social protection system that recognizes needs of informal workers in urban India as much as it recognizes needs for rural India, that expands according to income distress and contracts as the economy progresses. That's what an agile policy would be.
All right. A lot to reflect on with that. Dr. Panova, you work on several multilateral forums like BRICS, the W20 forum at G20, and you've raised your voice on these forums for gender equity. Increasingly, we're seeing that public diplomacy is lending itself as a platform for advocating for it. What is the role that multilateral forums can have in building international coalitions and also for promoting feminist foreign policy, a term that has gained a lot of currency, as we know, over the last couple of years. But obviously in parts of Europe and in North America, but not so much in the developing world. What are your views on that?
Okay, thank you so much. Well, indeed, there are different levels, and I think we've discussed those. They are women heroes, there are women victims, they are women in everyday life that actually do their job, and with that, they fight for their rights and they fight for the better future of themselves and of their children in this regard. But when we talk about multilateral organizations, it is very important to have such platforms in order, first of all, to exchange best practices that those countries have. Like in Women 20, we've learned a lot what's been happening with regards, even before the pandemic, with regards to what type of policies those countries have, where we can share their achievements of our countries. We have very different countries on the G20, from Saudi Arabia with kind of very first steps on their way to women empowerment, to European states who've gone quite a long way so far, at least in terms of political and economic empowerment. But there are issues with regards to social infrastructure. There are issues that you wouldn't think are relevant for all of our countries, but we find those common painful points. For example, I will give you some issues that seem to be not immediately clear or obvious. For example, health. Yes, we know that during the pandemic, lots of women are in rank and file, and they were hit hardest because they were at the forefront of fighting the pandemic. But at the same time, there is another aspect. Women and men perceive medicine differently. Not many of us know. We have those in medical instructions. It doesn't say it. It can give you differences with regards to the weight of the person, how much you have to of medicine you have to take, of what type of medicine you can take. But it doesn't give you differences that are existing biologically for men and women. And it needs also fighting the pandemic of how to best cure and how to best treat. You need to take such issues into account. And this has been one of the new issues that we started discussing within the Women 20, and I think it gave momentum to this point of view. Another is more obvious. Their women entrepreneurship and using digital means for women empowerment, for bringing more jobs, women who needed to go through pandemic times. Another point, and we've been raising it within Women 20. We've dealt and we raised it in our Women Empowerment Toolkit for the BRICS that we prepared last year, is that we can use means of education for strengthening women's participation in during the pandemic times, and we could use those digital means. And I think we should be looking more into that, because it is, as ladies at the very beginning, at the opening said, ladies lost jobs and they're less likely to recover those jobs as a result. So having the ability to get those skills from education that will be responding to their basic and advanced needs of the economy would actually help women without extra quotas to join this workforce back and actually at a better position. So I think this is also a very important point we have to have in mind.
Thank you so much for that. We're actually running out of time, and my last question will be to Chetna ji, and that is also goes back to what Ms. Chaturvedi had said. You work for decades on the inclusion of women, and you're very well placed to tell us what is keeping women from participating in the economy. You highlighted some of those points. I want to ask you about the role of collectives and self help groups in rural India. We've seen during the pandemic that they've shown so much resilience, stepped up for community response. And yet, again, when it comes to scaling up, building businesses, there is a gap. So, why do you think that exists? And what can be done?
So let me focus on particularly scaling up, right? And I would and I'll be very brief in that also. See, I just would like to say one line that when what Yamini mentioned about the schemes about Jan Dhan are addressing to women, which clearly indicates that women have proved something. So people are trying to, should bring those schemes and addressing or attracting women. Either it is Sukanya Yojana or it is direct benefit transfer, Jan Dhan, all those. But at the same time, you see that you don't see with Jan Dhan overdraft facility is being used by women. So what I find that when these collectives have come up and they have become that, they have shown, they have made themselves visible. Now what is to be done? And I would be very brief and share that as Dr. Panova mentioned, in BRICS with Business Alliance, Women-led Business Alliance, being a part of that, what have we done? In BRICS, we came out and we are actually requesting across the government, create in financial inclusion fund for women, which means you invest in women-owned businesses. How those details you can work out. But once you say that, okay, we are creating a fund and this fund will be investing in women-owned businesses in last mile. Women are already organized. They will come forward with their ideas. We have so many in Maharashtra, particularly. I would like to say, Chaturvedi ma'am, we know that Maharashtra has number of farmer producer company which are led by women. Now these farmer producer companies are there. These women are running these companies. They are at a very small companies. But unless you infuse capital in them, how are they going to scale? So that is one way of scaling. And here I would not take much time, but I would say that if such models are coming up, then the next step would be that how do we integrate them in the digital market? So are we having, government can come forward, have partnership with Flipkart, Amazon, and say that, okay, we want these number of women-owned companies to be on the digital market. Everybody wants to. Amazon Sakhi is the program in India where our women are representing. We are Women's Bank. So I do find that access to capital in such a very focused way, I'm talking, not as a schemes and something. You come with your program or a company or something where it's clearly that we invest. So I do think that we need to create such funds for last mile community, because we have to go from micro credit to micro enterprise. Micro credit was done by MFI. Now micro enterprise, if you want to do it, either do it through banks or create those funds at SEBI, Stock Exchange Board of India. Have some space to grassroots level women in SEBI, no? Why don't we want them in the Stock Exchange Board of India? Have a women-owned fund for women. I think these will be some, very radical steps are required, and these radical steps are taken forward, where we set up and register a fund in Stock Exchange Board of India and say that, yes, grassroots leaders can participate in it, women investor can participate, and grassroots leaders can take this facility on.
Thank you so much. I think we need a lot of time to discuss this topic, and we will be returning to it. But a lot of thoughts and solutions have come out of this discussion. Look at fresh appointments for gender budgeting, rise above politics. Create funds for investing in women businesses, push it through multilateral forums, and create policy that is sensitive to the everyday lives of women. I want to thank all our panelists for taking our time for this discussion. Thank you, Ms. Chaturvedi. Thank you, Chetna ji. Thank you, Dr. Panoma. And thank you, Yamini.